Well, my friends, even though it is a little bit before time, we have Murderers Row up here on the front. All of our speakers are here, and I want to make the best possible use of their time with you. So I'm going to start us early and just let other people come in as they do. I am Cory Fabbri, the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and it is my great privilege today to try and discipline a panel of extraordinary talent. General Paul Nakasone, the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the director of the National Security Agency. Agung Nugroho, the acting deputy of protection and National Cyber and Crypto Agency of Indonesia. David Koh, the chief executive of Cyber Security Agency and the deputy secretary for cyber in the Ministry of Defense here in Singapore. Air Commodore John Mas, senior military advisor to the EU Office for Common Security and Defense Policy, and Senior Colonel Xu Manshu, the professor at the National Security College of the People's Liberation Army. We are going to start out by having them each make a brief statement just to prime the pumps a little bit and then let you fire on their ramparts. So General Nakasone, why don't you start us off?
First round. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me begin by revisiting the U.S. National Security Strategy and the U.S. National Defense Strategy, which underpinned our commitment to the Indo-Pacific region. The United States seeks out and offers strategic partnerships, not strategic dependence. We do not ask partners to surrender their sovereignty or intellectual property. We aspire to build cooperative partnerships built upon trust, mutual interests, and respect. We seek all of this with the intent of ensuring a free and open Indo-Pacific region. These fundamental principles of partnership, governance, international defense apply in cyberspace just as they do in the air, land, sea, and space domains. We endeavor to realize a safe, secure, open, and free internet based upon rule of law and internationally accepted norms. The vision requires the cooperation of all nations, large and small, who share the belief that such an achievement is best for all nations. Achieving these lofty aspirations will require collaboration, trust, and persistent dialogue. It will require an unprecedented level of international partnerships. It is our belief that no one can succeed alone. In the United States, we realize that we cannot successfully defend and protect government networks and systems without a whole-of-government approach. We have also learned that we cannot protect the fundamental interests and national security of the United States without a whole-of-nation approach. Achieving a safe, secure, open, and free internet based upon rule of law and internationally accepted norms will likewise require an international effort at an unprecedented scale. We do this tangibly by what we call defending forward. As an example, during the 2018 midterm elections, at the invitation of a valued partner, we acted to defend not only our own elections, but enhance the capabilities of our partner to defend their own future elections. We're observing a change in the strategic environment now where the balance of power appears to be shifting from traditional patterns of international antagonism to a more dynamic and potentially dangerous paradigm of great power competition. The emergence of powerful technologies distinguished today's great power competition from decades ago. Now adversaries seek to gain the strategic advantage across every element of national power, including in cyberspace. The same technologies that enable populations to communicate broadly and enable self-determination also enable centralized control of populations internally and facilitate coercive actions by one state over another. The role of emerging technologies will allow malign actors to expand leverage over states economically, politically, militarily, and culturally. It is imperative that we fully understand the risks and potential consequences. For the United States, we see the continuous theft of our intellectual property and personally identifiable information as having a cumulative effect that are corrosive to our economy and our national security. Furthermore, campaigns by adversaries attempting to undermine our democratic processes and sow discord within our national discourse can also have caustic effects over time. The potential for destructive outcomes accomplished through cyber capabilities is therefore a constant concern. These realities of cyberspace should not overshadow the enormous possibilities to improve life and human capability. Whether the free flow and availability of information and knowledge, the enhancement of economic growth, or the unleashing of creativity and human potential, cyberspace and related technologies will be at the forefront. This dynamic highlights two worldviews of cyberspace: technologies that serve people and enhance quality of life, with technologies that serve governments to surveil, control access to information, and exert centralized control of a population and its intellectual capacity. Cyberspace capabilities have effectively shrunk the vast Indo-Pacific region, connecting the economies of Seattle, Tokyo, Seoul, Guangzhou, Sydney, Bangalore, New Delhi, and Singapore at the speed of light. This interconnectivity facilitates information flow, has economic implications, and inspires human potential. In the Indo-Pacific region, there are huge possibilities in smart megacities enabled by technology. But this dependence also comes with risks. These incredible capabilities demand even greater level of responsible behavior. Nations should aim to hold not civilian populations hostage to predatory or coercive actions in cyberspace. Nations should not seek to exploit the personally identifiable information of citizens from other nations. Nations should not interfere in democratic processes. It is our belief that these objectives ensure not only our national security, but also the security of our partners. In so doing, we expect to promote and enable a safe, secure, open and free internet based upon rule of law, internationally accepted norms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Agung.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to be panelists. Thank you. ISS, and thank you for the governments of Singapore. In this opportunity, I would like to say that in this fourth industrial revolution, there are possible risks may arise. So therefore, as part of the government, we have to draw our attention to the use of the internet as a global public goods, especially social media platforms which could be misused to threaten the national security by means of terrorism, also cybercrime, fake news, hoax, and other negative contents. The increase of the internet use for social media is a new challenge for the state. How to handle social media as part of democracy, to promote the inclusive and also in the same time the resilience. The improvement of cyber capability for defense apparatus in the Asia-Pacific region needs to be done continually and sustainably, considering the various levels of cyber capability in the region. We consider it is necessary to increase its capability through collaboration with partner countries in the region. And in response to rapidly increasing threats in cyberspace, Indonesia essentially acknowledges and complies with the UNGGE 2015 recommendation on the implementation of cyber norms and responsible state behavior in Asia-Pacific region. We also hope that UNGGE 2019 Council meeting will result a consensus that can contribute how to create positive impacts in managing cybersecurity. Indonesia concern on cyber diplomacy to mitigate the incidents and prevent the escalation to any conflicts amongst the countries. And the existence of a government as a state representative for other stakeholders, including non-state actors, can be utilized as a collaborator, the government as collaborator to create a safer and more prosperous world. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We were just commenting, Mr. Ko and I, on the fact that 3 years ago, this panel would not be standing room only in this room, and now it is. Mr. Ko.
Thank you very much, Cory. Yeah, very good afternoon, and colleagues, friends. Singapore is honored to host the 18th Shangri-La Dialogue, and it's indeed my privilege to speak again at a panel like this, and more importantly, alongside such esteemed personalities as yourselves. I'm struck that I'm the only representative from a small country on this panel. As my Prime Minister said last night, whether the elephants are making love or fighting, the grass suffers. Cyber is a particularly pertinent topic for smaller countries. We are dependent on it for our economic survival, and it can pose serious, possibly existential threats to us. The line between civil and military is no longer as distinct as it was in the 80s. Civilian, or rather commercial interests, and the security interests are now converging in the same operating space with far-reaching implications. This is particularly true for cyber, capability, capacity building, and infrastructure. Looking at the past year, Singapore has also been no stranger to cyber threats, both within and outside the security sector. In the former, within the security sector, Singapore is apparently the top cyber attack target in the world during the Kim-Trump summit. It's an accolade that we would rather not have. On the latter, outside the security sector, Singapore experienced its most serious theft of data when the private healthcare group Sing Health was attacked last June, and 1.5 million patients' non-medical personal data was stolen. The challenge that I face is that I wear two hats. One as the Chief Executive of the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, looking after the civilian side, and the other as the Defense Cyber Chief within the Ministry of Defense. So regardless of which sector is hit, I'm still responsible. The targets of malicious cyber actors are unlikely to be the traditional ones, the military or the national security agencies. Attacks on military infrastructure directly would raise alarms too quickly, and it might even elicit a robust retaliation. So instead, attackers will come at our civilian infrastructure, our healthcare, our transport sectors, the finance platforms, the things that keep our economy buzzing. The truth is that in the future battlefield, the future battlefield and the future economy are both converging in cyberspace. This is where my two jobs similarly converge. The question then is how security agencies can ensure that they are ready to deal with these threats to our civilian infrastructure, and who our partners will be in this endeavor. The biggest shift for security agencies is one of mindset. We have to accept that we need to rely on many other partners, including some non-traditional ones, to manage these cyber threats of the future. First, we have to rely on partners across the government. As what Paul Nakasone said, because of this wider attack surface, it will require a whole of government vigilance. Agencies that may not be used to thinking about security threats have to be alert and know when to share information with security agencies and determine whether an incident was just a benign glitch or is the first indicators of a sophisticated cyber attack. Second is that we need the support of industry partners, particularly civilian infrastructure owners. Just as in the kinetic world, security forces grapple with the ill-defined conflict zone where complex and civilians are residing in this area of conflict. But sometimes these civilians are partners who can provide valuable intelligence and help us form a clearer situation picture. Singapore has a Cybersecurity Act, which was passed last year. This establishes a framework for sharing of information and investigating cyber incidents. Our chances of recognizing and thwarting a cyber attack will be much higher if industry partners shared information voluntarily and as the situation developed. Third, we must work more closely with technologists and academia. In the past, innovation was funded primarily by governments. Today, the scale of commercial investments provides ample resources for R&D, and it incentivizes them to field technologies quickly. Governments and militaries do not have a monopoly on the most advanced technologies. We must work closely with the tech industry, academia, etc., to find solutions for today's cybersecurity gaps and understand what tomorrow's challenges may look like. A key area that defense establishments can contribute to is reducing the chances of miscalculations. Engaging in dialogue such as this on what are acceptable norms is an important start. Friends and colleagues, we live in an age of uncertainty where cyber attacks can come from anywhere and anyone in the world. And they will be aimed at targets which we may not be able to anticipate. To reduce the uncertainty, our governments, industry partners, technologists, and researchers must accept a collective responsibility of providing the safe and stable cyberspace for all, and in building trust and understanding. I look forward to the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Commodore Moss.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think when I start here, sorry about my throat a bit, I'm starting to lose my voice over the week, but this time last year we were talking about a lot about big data and the challenges of analysis. And I think having this subject again on the agenda is a very interesting point, because whilst there's a lot of debate going on in Europe now about AI, about bitchain, about quantum computing, swarm technology, all the high-end challenges that we're going to face, I think in the European Union, my job today is really tell you what we are doing, not in a case of it being pedagogic, but more that I think, from my experience, there's quite a lot that we can share in terms of our experience as a group of member states who come together. And certainly for ASEAN, this is a spin that we often put on. In basic terms, though, I think we all agree that probably when we talk about cyber, we're talking about information flow. It's the exchange that's key. It's the exchange that's necessary. And it's when that exchange takes place that the dangers and risks and opportunities occur all at the same point. For us, we're very well aware of now, with electoral fraud and other instances that are running in Europe, that the digital fingerprint left by citizens is one, and it is changing the dynamic. And it makes open source information superiority an essential security and defense tool. You know, for us now, metadata, I think, matters. In the case of a supranational organization such as the EU, and I see we have member states here represented, the global strategy underscores the very principle that our responsibility is to protect our citizens and help citizens protect themselves. So at the grand strategic level, we've taken the approach that cyber attacks, cyber crimes are crimes, and they should be treated as such. So echoing our American general colleague on the panel, the EU strongly promotes the position that international law, and in particular the UN Charter, applies in cyberspace and supports the development of non-binding voluntary norms of responsible behaviour by states and cyber confidence building measures as such. So if that's the pitch, what's the action? What are we really doing? And I'll just quickly run through a number of areas where you might be interested to hear what we have done over the last 18 months or so, certainly since the Fullerton Forum in 2018. We now have a joint EU diplomatic response, which we've called the Cyber Diplomacy Toolbox. And this toolbox is part of an ambitious cyber package that supports the latest cybersecurity strategy that we have and targets three key areas, which I'll just touch on briefly. First off, I think going back to protect citizens and protecting citizens protect themselves, building resilience is the #1 key. And to do that, we have now our Cybersecurity Act. It's recently adopted, and it enables the introduction of an EU-wide cybersecurity certification, and will also lead to the consolidation of a permanent agency for network information security, ENISA, where David and I have already discussed a potential outreach. The Cybersecurity Act enters in force this month of June. Separately, to give you an example, under something called permanent structured cooperation, member states are working together to, as an example, create cyber rapid response teams, which will be deployable along with cyber toolkits to support member states who request assistance in time of crisis, and also available to partners. We're looking at creating an effective response. So in addition to this cyber diplomacy toolbox, what we have enacted is an autonomous cyber sanctions regime that can be used in response to cyber attacks that threaten the Union or its member states. So whilst traditionally these sorts of panels talk about defence capability, do we need more widgets, do we need whatever, what I'm trying to give you is that from the EU perspective, we're addressing this from a regulatory point of view, which I think is especially useful when we look to compete in this space. And as I started in terms of our context, we are very much committed to the supporting of norms, and we support the establishment of a strategic framework for conflict prevention, cooperation and stability in cyberspace. Just a quick regional sort of outreach. The EU has also, I think, made good progress with our ASEAN colleagues, and we're very much supportive of the ASEAN Singapore Cybersecurity Centre of Excellence. So a few questions to chuck out there. As AI develops, may it trigger a paradigm shift in military affairs? Can defence keep up? I think a lot of that depends on how much money you have. Can dual-use technology offer a key? Looking ahead to the moral component, how to regulate against automated responses and autonomous operations. And will the ethical conduct constrain the defender but not the unethical opponent? So just to finish, as with a footnote on artificial intelligence, in case anyone out there is interested on the EU's attitude, there are 3 dimensions in particular that we think in this regard that we're developing. So first one is governance. The EU is actively engaged in defining legal and ethical standards in this regard, with the human-centric principle at the core. And then separately, we're looking at a concepts and capability approach, where we need to better understand how AI will impact on our security and defence in terms of introducing AI into our capabilities. We're also working on lethal autonomous weapons systems, we call them laws, but also in regard to ensuring that our capabilities can withstand an adversary's attack using AI in any form. And lastly, the outreach, and I know that in the audience today we have industry. We need to ensure that European industries R&D is developing cutting-edge AI applications, and in the future we'll be looking for a clear legal framework which tailors investments, and that will open up, we hope, a capacity for us to provide EU funding. Voila, in 3.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Senior Colonel Shi.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shakim. Actually, it's my first time to be Shangri-La Dialogue. So I'd like to thank IISS and Singapore to give my chance to show my views with such privileged panelists and guests. According to my research, I like to make 4 points on this topic, on this session. First, the arms race in cyberspace has begun. When coupled with the conventional capability, cyber technology has acted as a force multiplier and enables the military gain the information timely, strike remotely, and exercise command and control globally. And what's more, emergent cyber technology, which may change the war game, including big data, 5G, quantum, AI, etc., have become the focus of competition among major powers. So that's why I say the arms race in cyberspace has begun. The second, the cyber makes the conflicts more complicated. From the technical perspective, the nature of the cyberspace have led to more confrontations along with geopolitical tensions. So meanwhile, no country is able to fully control of cyberspace in some degree, in my opinion. Unfortunately, more national states and even non-state actors had mastered the cyber tools which could undermine the critical infrastructure and military networks of others. So it's more difficult than ever for the modern countries to withstand the large-scale cyber attacks. So even though the offense is much easier than defense in cyberspace, we have to remind ourselves that no technology should be used as an excuse to start a war. Given that overuse of cyber attacks may result in huge risks and even kinetic retaliation, so it's a responsibility for the military to maintain strategic restraint on how to use its cyber capability. Third, cyber confidence building measures are needed, especially for major powers. On the one hand, as cyber presents increasing risks to strategic stability, so it's urgent to find feasible approaches to avoid miscalculation between competitors. On the other hand, there are still some disputes on cyber norms of responsible state behaviors and how certain international law applies to cyberspace. So what should we do to go forward? I think bilateral cyber confidence building measures could be a good option. I like to make 3 proposals. The first one is to build a notification mechanism on cyber policies in order to better understand strategic intention. The second one is to set up the diversified communication channels at working levels, including telephone links, contact points between 2/3 cyber response teams in case of fast response to cyber incidents. The third one is to launch a joint academic research to deeply understand the concerns and common ground. I think this is very key to foster the understanding at the policy level and then recommend respectively to drive positive bilateral interaction in cyberspace. So the fourth one, prevent new risks arising from emerging technology in advance. It's no doubt that any breakthroughs of technologies will be sure to be transferred into the military field. So in that case, risk assessment and mitigation should be taken into account, especially prevention measures against proliferation and malicious use of cyber technology. And what's most important thing when deploying new technology is to keep goodwill. It should be also responsibility for the militaries to ensure that the cyber technology continues to benefit the human race rather than create a frontier for another battlefield. I will end there. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. I think I heard some continuities in all 5 of the presentations that I might just draw out for your consideration while people are thinking of their questions. The first is how much this area would benefit from establishing agreed rules, that is, extending the rules-based international order into the Wild West of cyber, because the second thing I thought I heard was what a very high degree of difficulty we will have doing that. That is that compared to, say, 3 years ago, if we had had this panel, there's a lot less emphasis and excitement about the upside of technology and connectivity, and a lot more anxiousness about the threats it poses for us as societies. The third continuity I thought I heard in everybody's presentations was the impossibility of segregating the military and civilian aspects of this problem. And that does make it somewhat more complicated than other domains of warfare. The fourth continuity I thought I heard was both the enormous advantages of establishing goodwill in these areas and the kinds of practical confidence building measures that the senior colonel emphasized, but the difficulty because there are so many asymmetric advantages possible in cyber. So we have a room full of sharpshooters from business, from journalism, from academia, and from governments. I see nameplates in the first row. Raise your hand, and I will call on you. First up, Mr. Raska.
Very much. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. I'm Mike Raska from RSIS. I have a very quick question to General Nakasuna. If you think about the future direction and character of cyber-enabled conflicts in Asia Pacific. If you were to extrapolate with the diffusion of advanced technologies and thinking about sort of the character of future conflicts regarding to cyber, what features or what is it that you are worried about thinking about the future? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think we should take a step back and just let's recall where we've been on this journey of different cyber threats over the past 10 years. We began with a very, very strong concern about exploitation, particularly exploitation of our classified networks. And then rapidly that devolved to disruptive attacks that nation states were conducting against some of our networks. And then we were very, very concerned about destructive capabilities that might come up in cyber, the ability for a 1 or 0 to provide destructive capabilities primarily against your critical infrastructure. Here's an element that we have seen that I think we should all think about, and that is the power of influence operations. We have seen that from our nation in our democratic processes, where nations have attempted to spawn and attack both sides of an issue to provide concern and conflict within our societies. This ability to rapidly provide information that oftentimes is not true, to a broad mass of the population, often through social media, is a feature I think that we've already seen that we must be concerned about in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Can I just jump in?
Please.
Can I just jump in and just build on Paul's point that you framed the issue as one of conflict, but I think that besides cyber-enabled conflict, I think cyber also enables competition, conflict below the threshold of war. So influence operations is one particular area, hybrid type operations. For a small country like Singapore, multiracial, multi-religious, I think the threat of influence operations exploiting the fault lines that exist in all our societies between different socioeconomic groups, between different language, religions, races, I think is a very real one. And the fact that attribution is difficult in cyber, that potential cloak of anonymity adds to the attractiveness of this, and that it can potentially come from anywhere. I think this is a major area which of concern.
Mr. Joshi.
Thank you very much. I just want to continue your thought, Cory, on norms and that challenge of establishing norms. At the beginning, General Nakasone talked specifically, he ended his comments by noting the sort of problematic nature of the theft of personally identifiable information and how he put that in a similar category to election disruption and other sorts of disruptive activity. I mean, it's interesting. The first place many of our minds might have gone to for that were things like the attack on or the theft of the Office of Personnel Management information in the United States. I think that touches on the difficulty of establishing norms, because your predecessor, Michael Hayden, in reference to that OPM attack, said it was a legitimate foreign intelligence target, and he, as NSA director, would not have thought twice about going after it. The US position on trying to establish those norms has been to say election disruption is in one category, intellectual property theft is in one category, but political intelligence gathering is legitimate and separate and acceptable. I just wonder how other members of the panel would respond to that distinction, whether they would accept it, whether they would qualify it, whether they would seek to put things in different categories in the way that the way that the US has done.
Commodore Moss, do you want to? Looked like you wanted to speak to that.
I was quite happy to speak to the previous one as well. I think the issue is, and again, sorry to turn to our Singaporean colleague David, but this is exactly the conversation that we've been having in and around hybrid, because for us in the European Union, we've been trying to address the issues that are involved with maybe what is going to get in front of any military phase of a conflict. So it could be, how are you going to be outmaneuvered before you actually come to the combat phase? So for us, I think we've taken the approach that cyber in this particular case covers everything from elements of CT, elements of CVE, elements of crime, organized crime. There is very often a common thread here which has got a digital connection to it. And the misinformation aspect is something that is right in the forefront of our awareness, because one of the key moral aspects of being a European and being in the European Union is this freedom of speech. So at what point, and it's a very subtle area, can we actually enable our strategic communications task forces, of which we have set up 3 recently, one looking at a sort of a Slavic Russian-based language, one for Africa and one for the Middle East. It's at what point do you have that tipping area where our parliament will not allow us to go any further because you're now infringing on liberties? So this is a key element and something that I think is a very good question and really needs driving down to, but it's at the heart of understanding how you need to respond in hybrid circumstances.
Other panelists? No, nobody else is going to take this
me?
up? Yeah, go ahead.
Singapore is deeply committed to a rules-based multilateral international order. I think for a small nation, this is the only way to go. What's the alternative? Law of the jungle? So both in the kinetic physical world, things like UNCLOS, freedom of navigation, overflight, World Trade Organization for trade, as well as in the non-kinetic world, in cyber in particular. There are existing norms. The United Nations group of governmental experts, which Pak Agung talked about, had achieved 2 sets of consensus reports, one in 2013 and another one in 2015. The consensus report in 2015 went subsequently to the General Assembly, and there are 11 rules of responsible state behavior for cyber. Last year, when Singapore chaired the ASEAN, we've managed to get ASEAN ministers in charge of cybersecurity to endorse in principle the 11 norms of responsible state behavior for cyber. And these were subsequently sent to the leaders in ASEAN and they've supported this as well. So there are existing norms, and it's not a total Wild West as what Cory and some people might think it is. These would limit what can be done or what should be done in cyber. I think we can build on those.
Senior Colonel?
To be continued about the cyber norm, questions about cyber norms. I think the major difficulty to reach the international norms on cybersecurity is we have to think more about the specific nature of the cyberspace. Increase connectivity, increasing vulnerability, and still anonymous. So I don't think we have enough. We have enough. The international community have enough consensus. So enough consensus on international norms. The problem is we don't know how to enforce that. So we need internet technical solutions. Public will is not enough to guarantee that. So what should we do? Maybe the major powers could do together to provide this sort of a public cyber goods to support the enforcement, this sort of rules. Thank you.
Thanks. Secretary Spencer.
As many of you know, because it was public information, over the last couple of years, the U.S. Navy suffered some exfiltrations through our partners in the supply chain side of the world, and it ended squarely at my feet. And I recently conducted a cyber review of the Navy, and engaged some highly qualified experts. But I'd like to throw out just a statement to see how our experts can comment on this, because I worry about taxonomy. What I have found is cyber defense is simply sharpening one side of the blade. You have to have offense to have defense. To have expertise in defense, you have to have offense. In open societies, that's a very difficult conversation to have, let alone the authorities that go out with that. I'd like to put that before our group and see what the thoughts are.
I think I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to take a swing at that, and I'm going to start with you, Mr. Coe.
Secretary Spencer throws a real curveball. I think it is a challenge. I think the old adage is the best form of defense is offense. But I speak for the organization that I lead, the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. It is squarely responsible for defense. We have no offensive mission. We look after the critical infrastructure. It maps, I think, roughly in the US to DHS responsibilities for critical information infrastructure. It is a challenge because in order to be able to defend, you have to know what the attacker is capable of. But I don't think it requires the individual people to be to actually do the offense. You just have to be aware of this. So I think I agree with the Secretary that it is a challenge in societies because it's analogous perhaps to bomb-making skills. If you want to know how to defuse bombs, you need to know how to build them. But then the question is that after you've taught the person how to build a bomb, does he become a threat? In the physical world, you can control the bomb-making tools. These are the precursors, etc. So these give you a certain element of security. For cyber, the tools which are the precursors, you can buy it from a Radio Shack. So that becomes a real challenge in terms of how you control this.
I have to say, I think that's a genuinely brilliant analogy. Mr. Moss, what's your answer to this? Commodore Moss, what's your answer to this?
John's fine. There has been a cyber hack as well on the ISS website because I look much younger in my photo than I do in reality, which is very unfortunate. But I think for us in the EU, I must be clear, we are not developing an offensive capability, but we are aware that a number of our member states do have that capability, and that a number of those who are equally members of NATO are in the throes, I think, of offering that capacity. So I sort of come back to where we are as a effective supranational organisation, which is we're really focusing on the building of resilience. But I think if I take up our cyber sanctions regime, it is as close as we can get to an offensive capability. So if we think that somebody is coming against our union, because we now realise that our infrastructure as the European Union itself is vulnerable, if they're coming against the institution or they're coming against a member state, we see that as malicious, and we see that the regulation with international law is already sufficient for us now to apply our autonomous sanctions regime. It's something that we have to develop, and I will be very open with you here that as a union of 28, we work on consensus. Sanctions are a very sensitive issue which have their heart lain in member states' competence, but from time to time we can get our 28 consensus, and then that has an effect, and that really has an effect against the individual who is going to be perpetrating the malicious act.
Mr. Agung.
Thank you. As Mr. David said, that we have to have the knowledge at least about the offense before you build your defensive power or defensive capability. I do agree with that, but in my opinion, based on Indonesia interest for or in international relations, we have a free and active approach. So Indonesia don't need the offensive capability. We always propose the prosperous internet, the role models of the norms that will increase the economy, a digital economy. And I think it's a a problem from the major countries, how to control the information. So yes, there's a technological gap between the major countries and the other countries. Indonesia is not the major countries. So building the defense capability for Indonesia is the first step. The first step, and Indonesia will propose in creating the cyber norms to enhance the defense capability and work together, collaboration with not just state collaboration, government to government, but also the academia and other entities. As you know, Indonesia has many underground groups. How to handle the underground groups that maybe attacks Singapore, maybe attack Singapore, but how to handle it. We learned from General Nakasone how to handle the cyber attackers. There is a voluntary vulnerability disclosure program. It's a very, very effective way. We have had about less than 1 year that program, but we'll gain very, very positive results. We have about 200 until 300 persons per year, so we can control the attackers. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Senior Colonel Shi.
In some degree, I agree with you. In cyberspace, defense things and offensive things mixed together. So it's hard to distinguish these two things. But I still prefer the cyber defense, defensive capability. Just consider two questions. The first one is who will win under the when each side have the enough capability to do a cyber attack. My answer is the one have a strong resilience will survive, will succeed. The second question is what would you do at the first place when you experience the cyber attack? I think no one would want to say how to retaliate, how to cyber attack a bank. I think the first thing is to how to recover. So that's why I think the cyber defense capability, a defensive capability, and cyber resilience is much important than cyber offensive capability.
Thank you, Colonel Shi. General Nakasone.
David Koh talked about this idea of our adversaries operating below the level of armed conflict, stealing our intellectual property, leveraging our personally identifiable information, attempting to interfere in our democratic processes. What Secretary Spencer discussed in terms of the concerns that we as a nation have of our intellectual property and what we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years is after a tremendous amount of money and resources that have been dedicated to building the walls higher, the best defenses that we can perhaps muster. But what we've learned is that that's only one side of the coin. Where we have moved and where we are focused on U.S. Cyber Command and our nation is an idea of persistent engagement. What's persistent engagement? It's really two parts. It's first of all being able to enable our partners, sharing our information, sharing tradecraft, understanding what our adversaries are doing. But it's also acting. It's acting outside our national boundaries. It's looking for malware. It's looking for infrastructure. It's looking for adversaries that are attempting to do us harm. And when authorized, we are going to act against them. And that's the second part of the coin. This is the part that we have to have a good balance on in terms of not only a defense, but also the capability to act when authorized. Because our adversaries today, operating below this level of armed conflict, with almost all the advantages that they have, with very, very low barriers to enter, have tremendous advantages. That's how we see it today.
Excellent. Next on my list, Ms. Begg.
Thank you, Cory. I'm Golnaz from Facebook, so this whole topic is very pertinent and relevant to us. I have many, many questions, but I'll keep it to two.
Actually, keep it to one, please. We've got
okay.
a really long list.
So it's great to hear that we acknowledge that technology can be a force for good, but also can be used to surveil and control. Especially in my experience dealing with this region, especially in times of crisis, other principles which are valuable, such as privacy, freedom of expression, tend to be thrown out the window when it's a situation of crisis. So my ask to the panel is, how are you systematically thinking about developing a systematic way of thinking and systematic technical solutions which build in considerations for privacy and freedom of expression on top of concerning security? Thank you.
Interesting. Anybody want to take a hit at that? General Nakasone?
I'd like to first start, if I could. I come back to our own experiences, working very, very closely with social media companies during the defense of our midterm elections. I think it begins with partnerships. I think it's an understanding between our governments and our private industry on what's the idea of responsible behavior. And one of the things that we did during the security of the midterm elections, working through the Foreign Influence Task Force with the Department of Justice, was share all the information that we knew of what adversaries were doing. And based upon that, social media companies took action. I think that's the right dialogue. I think that's the right partnership. I think it's the right model in terms of being able to understand, even in terms of crisis or extremist situations, where we have to move towards.
Mr. Pothier, you're next.
Thank you very much, Cory. Fabrice Potier from IISS. A question to each panelist. What do they think of greater disclosure of national capabilities? I'm asking this question because, as John Shipman mentioned yesterday, IISS is starting the first ever global cyber power audit, basically to try to draw an inventory of what the cyber arsenals and what are the cyber powers out there. And the reasons behind that is we think that you cannot achieve strategic stability in the cyberspace until you start counting the beans and until you start knowing who has what and who employs what in what circumstances. So I'm putting that to the panelists who would like to have their view about the cyber disclosure. Thank you.
Okay, let me ask people to go down the row and say, I'm in favor of greater disclosure, or I have concerns about greater disclosure. General Nakasone, you're first.
Well, certainly within our government, we have a vulnerability disclosure program that's run by our government, and it involves a broad range of elements of our different cabinet secretaries and departments. We take a look at those vulnerabilities, and then based upon that, obviously that guides our actions in the future. I think that you offer up a very interesting idea. I think the tremendous challenge of this is, will every single nation provide the same amount of disclosure?
Mr. Agong.
Yes. Building the confidence building measure for the cyberspace is the essential way. So we cannot, of course, disclosure our capability, especially for defensive capability, because it's it's the last piece of our information capability. But I think if possible, we can define the territory of cyberspace for each state in the world. Thank you.
Mr. Call.
I think that's a fascinating idea. I think but I have a big challenge in terms of addressing the question, in terms of how do you measure what cyber capability is. I think IISS has started this, but unlike the kinetic world, in the digital world, how does one measure capability? Secretary Spencer started us off by talking about taxonomy. So I think it's a similar question. In the digital world, what is the capability? Do you count battalions? Do you count combat aircraft? Do you count ships? So I think that the first challenge will be what Paul Naksoni talked about, like will we have the same level of transparency? Second one is that actually what are we talking about? How do we count this? Does size matter in the digital world? So I think these are some of the thoughts that I have, but it's a fascinating idea. Thank you.
John.
Sorry, I can be very quick because, of course, for the EU, we work at a certain level in that it wouldn't be our responsibility to push for member states that would be their decision. But what I can say is that working in the EU, it's one of the most transparent organisations that I've worked with. So it's very easy to find out what we're doing and where we're building our capacity, be it in EU CERT linking up with the NATO CERC or whatever it happens to be. So I think, yes, we're in favour of that. I mean, if I could just come back on the Facebook question, one of the key things that we have to deal with in crisis management in the EU is engaging with social media. And the sense that I have in Europe at the moment is that the mantra that's coming back is social media itself has a social responsibility. I touched initially on metadata. I think now people are starting to wake up just how dramatic the tool is that they have when they upload their photograph of them at the IISS forum on cyberspace, where you know too well how you can then track who I meet and then move on from there. So the open source element of that is something that we take extremely seriously. And I think the only way that we can deal with it in terms of our strategic communication, and we do this with our task forces, is to work with you. I mean, we have links, for example, to Facebook and others, but I think it has to be a partnership, and we have to understand what it is we do when we click send.
Colonel Shi?
Actually, I'm a bit lost, but I try to grasp your idea. I'm also interested in the cyber index mentioned yesterday. Interesting, and it is very useful to. This is an index to measure the cyber capability of the state. Yeah, this is a question related to cyber capability and transparency. So, I think it could be the same story for the other things in the things transparency things in other domain traditional domain. If the country couldn't have enough capability in a low level, they would like to be transparent with their all the capability, but they would like to transparent about the strategical intention.
Thanks. We had a question from the back row.
Thank you very much. My name is Khalid Benouri. I'm a retired Air Commodore. My question is about the inadequacy of the international law, and since that thunder is stolen, let me rephrase. I do not share the enthusiasm about the success of the group of governmental experts, and I think there are some areas which are interesting, but there's a lot of space that requires a lot of work internationally and in the UN system. So my question to the panel is, how swiftly can a code of conduct can be created meanwhile, and can it be brought to a near universal following? Thank you.
Mr. Ko, you were laughing, so I'm going to you first.
I don't think I share the pessimism. I think that there were two consensus reports at the UN group of governmental experts. As I said, this has gone to the General Assembly, where it was accepted by all member states. Within ASEAN, we've managed to raise the level of awareness about cyber concerns, threats, And we've managed to get consensus within ASEAN that we will support the principle of the 11 rules of responsible state behavior. So in a remarkably short time, 3 years, when we started the conversation in ASEAN, we've managed to raise that level of awareness and the agreement that we want to commit to this. But I agree that there's a long way to go. I'm laughing because I don't think that the next step is a code of conduct. I think the next step is confidence building measures. So when among the ASEAN ministers, when they discussed the issue of the norms of responsible state behavior, the question that they had was that, okay, we agree that these are good norms that we would want to build on. But now that we do this, we need to build our own capacity to be able to build resilience in our networks, our own capacity to be able to manage our own network so that attacks are not emanating from our territories. And thirdly, the ability to detect attacks when they take place. So this is the focus that we're having in ASEAN, capacity building. So I think capacity building, together with confidence building measures, this will be the next step, well before we talk about a code of conduct.
Mr. Neal, you're next.
Thanks, Cory. A question to General Nakasone. Almost 20 years ago, your predecessor, General Hayden, was facing an enormous challenge, which was a migration of communications onto fiber optics. Do you think with the advent of 5G that you are facing a crisis of similar magnitude?
So I guess I would use the word opportunity. I think that as we look to the future, you've identified obviously one of the great opportunities for us. The amount of data that is going to suddenly be facing us is a tremendous growth than what we've seen. And so for what we have done, and one of the things that I challenge the people that work at both our command and our agency is we solve hard problems. This is a hard problem, but it's also an opportunity for us. And I think it really goes to, this is where the future is moving. So we have to take this problem on. We have to look at it as in terms of what can we do against it. But I think you've identified obviously one of the near-term pieces that we will all be focused on, and that is this explosion of data in the near term.
Mr. Barron, you're next.
Thank you, Cory. As one of the few resident journalists here, I have a question about disclosure of a different kind, and that's to the public when there are threats and when there are responses. I think the British and some countries may be farther out ahead than others on how they choose to disclose when there are cyber attacks, what the government or agencies are going to do about it, how much to name and shame actors. In your respective countries, would you like to see more of that, or do you think the status quo or less is more beneficial? What's the current state of secrecy versus public disclosure on that? And for General Nakasone, you said twice specifically.
One question apiece.
Well, it's the same thread. All right.
So let's work our way down the table this way this time. The specific question Mr. Barron asked was, will your government disclose when attacks are occurring and what they are doing about them? Or your international organization for our EU colleague. Colonel Shi? Okay.
Yeah, so quickly to me. Yes, I think we do the best we can. If it's clearer, earlier, it's easier, but you have to be right. So, I mean, that's the principle that I think we face, is that if, for example, you were to perpetrate what appeared to be something in the health sector that wasn't the case, then no one is going to be pleased to be told the wrong thing early. They want to get the right information at the right time. But I think this is something we're definitely working on. There's a separate subject which is to do with attribution. That is another area where we're very, very keen to see how we can drill down. We've had to do it with a CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear sanctions regime, where we now have the ability to sanction individuals as a union, where we are saying that we'll go against the person rather than the state. Because for us, we're very clear that attribution is a member state competence. It's not for the union to attribute because there's so many political connotations. But your theory is correct, and then, of course, I come back to our duty to protect our citizens. If they need to know that something's going on, then we have to protect them.
Mr. Koh?
Yeah, I think there is a responsibility to inform. So in the case of Singapore, we are governed by a Personal Data Protection Act, where when companies have discovered a leak of information, especially personal identifiable information, they are obligated to inform the authority, and very often that this then subsequently comes out in the public. In the case of last year, when we had the Singh Health cyber attack, two ministers went out on public to inform the public about this, the Minister for Health and the Minister in charge of cybersecurity, to declare what had happened in the state. But as exactly as what John says, if you want to do that, you have to be very clear on the facts. It's no use coming out in public and then being asked like, so how bad is it? Or we're still looking, we don't know. What's the extent? What have you lost? Or we don't know. You can't afford to do that. So you have to be able to complete the investigation to a fair level of certainty before you come out to the public. But there is a responsibility to inform.
Mr. Agong?
Yes, of course, governments has a responsibility to inform to the public and our other stakeholders. Even our government still in a process for creating the Cybersecurity Act in this year. Maybe will be finalized by it. But we have a consensus in our country that for cybersecurity is the collective responsibility. The government, of course, can detect the potential threats or vulnerability. Then we'll share the information to the stakeholders, the operators, and mitigate together. And I think the chance of the domino effect of the incidents can be controlled. Thank you.
General Nakasone?
So ultimately for us, this is a policy decision, and policymakers will make that determination of when the attribution will occur. My role and the role of our agency in command is ensuring that we have clear and compelling evidence with regards to what has occurred. That's what we're focused on. That's what we're going to be doing with partners. That's what we're going to be doing with our allies. That's what we're going to be doing with our technology, is ensuring we have that clear and compelling evidence that points to who may have done something.
Colonel?
Yeah, thank you. From the Chinese government side, to respond to the cyber attacks, cyber incidents, we have two important components. The first one is the information sharing mechanisms between the different sectors, as well as private firms. The second component is we publish the emergency response plan on different levels. In addition, we conduct the cyber exercise on the national level. That's all.
Mr. Boyle?
Thank you. You've talked about cyber crimes, rules of norms, but there doesn't seem to be any international organizations designed to hold accountability for this. Should there be? Does there need to be? When will there be?
Excellent. Anybody want to take that? Colonel?
I think yes. We need to establish the special organized for counter the cybercrime, and I think these things should be under the UN framework. And I also think the major powers could contribute more to do these things.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? John, go ahead.
Sort of a comment on a comment. I think that the principle of having a UN-based organization would be good, so long as getting there didn't cause in itself a greater problem, which is where we come back to this idea that actually, if you look at the idea behind what is malicious and what is a crime, then the international law should apply, and you can respond in that sense. So to be clear, what I'm saying here is, it's not exactly a personal view, but it's a sort of a personalised view, is that you just need to take care of relying on something else to be all-encompassing if it is unlikely that you're going to get in the short-term agreement, and then you can end up in a worse position because until we have an agreement there is no standard, and we're saying that we think there is a standard that can apply. And I think actually, listening to the Shangri-La dialogue over the last day and a half, there seems to be a lot of support for this idea of already supporting international norms and rule-based order.
Ms. Chen.
Okay, thanks, ma'am. My question goes to General Paul Nakasone. When the economic historian look at what happened in history in major power competition, they actually came up with the basic roadmap that first you have the trade war, then that's upgrades into technological war, then to financial war, then either cold war or hot war. I'm not saying that how much that will be translated into today's reality, but that what repeatedly took place in history. So nowadays, there are already increasing talk about a potential AI Cold War among major powers, specifically between China and the United States. So I hope you can share your views about where we are now and what's your prospects about the potential AI Cold War.
General Nakasone.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I see it as an AI Cold War. I can speak from where we're looking for the future. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, where we're trying to move to, this provides us great opportunity. We see the power of what can be done when we're able to harness data, whether or not it's the self-healing network or it's the ability for us to better provide malware and forensics identification. So when I look to the future and I see this, I would anticipate that other nations are looking at this capability as well. I think the challenge will be is how is this going to be used in the future? And so from our perspective, we will continue to act responsibly, to continue to use this within in the rule of law and certainly within the established norms.
Mr. Rain.
Hi. Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about the commercial sector. It seems to me that when we're talking about national defence, and particularly looking at the nature of the economies that are represented by the panel, there are critical data holders in the commercial sector who need to protect their data both on behalf of their clients but on behalf of their country's prosperity and stability. And looking back to the origins of the conversation on cybersecurity, say 10 years ago when it began in earnest, one of the striking features has been the rapid accumulation of personal data outside of government control and government hands. And in many ways, that's a healthy thing. It's a reflective of a healthy growth in economic traffic and economic interchange. But my question to the panel is how do you feel about the current distribution of labour between, to put it crudely, governments on the one hand and commercial entities on the other? I'm particularly thinking about the financial sector and social media. Do you think that that balance of labour is about right? And if not, how would you adjust it?
Mr. Ko, you want to start that one?
Wow. In future, I should sit further away from the chairperson. I think the commercial entities, especially those who have A, large stores of data, personal or otherwise, and B, those who are managing critical information infrastructure. Those are the infrastructure that are providing essential services to the people and to the nation. I think they have to be increasing their level of awareness, their level of investment in cybersecurity. The balance of labor, as you put it, may not be ideal where it is today. I think the recognition should be that responsibility is just not to the firm themselves, but firstly to the firm, secondly to the individuals, the data that they hold, and thirdly, if they're providing essential services, to society as a larger concept. So I think there probably has to be a greater awareness of the responsibility and be greater investment in cybersecurity. I think many corporations seem to look at cyber security today as a cost driver. However, I think they should see it as an investment. I think Pak Agong said that cyber is a public good. In some respects, that is the case. That's one perception of it. But I think if you are holding some of this data, that you have to recognize that you are part of the solution.
If I might just add to David's comments, Dr. Shaki, when she began the discussion today, had 4 different points that she said many of us all talk towards. I think there's a 5th one here as well, and that's this idea of partnerships. You hit on it with your question. As we operate in the future, what's changed in cybersecurity over the past 10 years are the explosion, the capability of private companies, capabilities. Take a look at the analysis, the collection, the dissemination. It looks like a nation state for many examples. So we, as all purveyors here, have to understand what are the partnerships we're going to form, and how are those partnerships going to be governed, and how are we going to be able to leverage it, and how do we understand each other?
Excellent. Colonel.
Yeah, fast response. I think your question mentioned the challenge for each government. It's sort of new challenge for each governance. I think the point is for the government is how to keep the balance between the public security and the privacy protection and freedom of speech. Okay.
Anyone else?
Well, I do agree with David. The first is the awareness, public or society awareness. Then the regulator itself of the awareness from the regulators, and the last is the operators of the critical infrastructure. Then the second is I concern about the gap of the knowledge from between the regulators and the operators. In my country, in Indonesia, the businesses, the private sectors is more knowledge about the cybersecurity than the regulators. So it's a part of the our problem, but I think it's majority in this world. There's a gap knowledge about the government as the regulators and the businesses as the operators. Thank you.
Next up, Ms. Vika.
Thank you, Cory. My question is directed to Mr. Ko. You mentioned earlier that influence operations is another form of cyber-related conflict. Singapore recently passed the online falsehood bill. Would you consider this as a cybersecurity strategy? And would you encourage other countries to do the same for rules-based cyberspace?
No, we don't see this as part of cyber security issue. I think perhaps there are 3 ways to look at it. One is the connectivity. Second is the content, and the third level is cognition. So the cybersecurity element of it really is the connectivity. The content would be the Prevention of Online Falsehoods Act. That will be looking at the content, and in particular the concern about influence operations, fake news, etc. For the Cybersecurity Act, on the other hand, deals with the connectivity. So it deals with the ability to connect and provide the services which are essential to the country.
Mr. Lai.
Yeah, recently, I think this year, April, the U.S.-Japan 2+2 statement just have these segments that the cyber attack is constitute the armed attack that apply for the Article 5 for the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. So my question is that to what extent, what kind of response this will be, and what will be, is that going to be the proportion of cyber versus cyber, and to what extent that the kinetic response will be applied? So I think this question not only goes to US Japan, but to General Nakasone. I also like to ask the NATO's response as well. Thank you.
Well, it's difficult for me, obviously, to predict the policy direction on this. But what I can say about our own nation's policy with regards to being attacked in cyberspace, it is very clear, and our country has been very, very specific about the fact that we will not limit ourselves only to a response in cyber. That if attacked, our critical infrastructure or other significant attack, all elements of our national power would come into, and that would be a decision, obviously, of our president and senior policymakers to make.
So I do not, although we have a Commodore from a NATO country, he is in an EU job. So unless you really want to weigh in on this, I'll give you a pass.
Come on, give it me. If I understand the question correctly, you're saying that a cyber attack is not covered by Article 5. And I think I would refer you to the recent work that was done in the Tallinn Manual in the NATO-accredited Centre of Excellence for Cyber, where there has been a good deal of work done. And please, if I am wrong, I apologise in public. But I think you'll find that actually it doesn't define that a cyber attack cannot be responded to under Article 5. But what I'd also say is, with my European Union hat on, there is also within the Lisbon Treaty Article 222 and Article 42.7. And those also have a capacity for the Union itself, for a member state to come to the Union and ask for support, solidarity, when they have been subject to an attack that causes, and it can be anything from a man-made disaster through to an overwhelming of the government. So I think it's probably worth just digging out your Tallinn Manual to see exactly where the latest guidance is, and then refer to the Washington treaties, which I think are quite explicit in when Article 5 can and can't be triggered.
Mr. Hackett.
Thanks, Cory. I've got a question about defence structures, really, organisational structures. I mean, one of the big challenges, I suppose, organisations face is in recruiting and retaining the right people now to sort of mount these, tackle these technological challenges in cyber organisations. So I wonder what, amid competition from the private sector for these people, for these specialists, what challenges in terms of perhaps like unit cohesion have you faced as you've stood up cyber organisations? You know, as armed forces, some of them reorientate towards more traditional military challenges. How have you managed to sort of continue to integrate non-traditional specialisms in your unit formations?
Let's go straight down the line on this. General Nakasone.
I think you highlight one of the challenges that we have out there in terms of recruiting, but I would broaden it and say what we have seen is we have a tremendous ability to recruit talent, whether or not it's a U.S. Cyber Command or the National Security Agency. We do a really good job at training them, and then the really fundamental hard problem is retaining our best. This is the challenge that we will all have. The way that we've approached it is really two-part. One is a series of targeted of pays that obviously reward those that are our best skills and most desired skills. But here's the other piece, that we will never be able to compete within a money realm. Where we do compete, though, is these are folks that want to solve hard problems. And if you want to solve hard problems, if you want to be able to do that, and you want to be able to work with cutting-edge tools and people that are incredibly smart, come be with us. That's an attractive mechanism for the really, really good talent that we have out there.
Does anybody have a different answer to that, as opposed to just rephrasing that excellent answer? Okay, then I am going to give Sir Tom Beckett the last question.
Thank you, Cory. I suppose this is the flip side of John Rain's part on the commercial side. I mean, in history of warfare, there's been mercenaries for forever. And there are companies who are reported to be behaving in a rather mercenary manner, private cybersecurity companies, who sell their capability to nation states who don't have an indigenous capability who may want to use it to, for their own, to restrict domestic freedoms or to interfere in the domestic affairs of neighboring countries. Cyber has an infrastructure and it has people, and so those mercenaries are based in other states. Now, some of the states that are buying it appear to be partners of many of our countries, and some of the places where they're based are also partners of many of our countries. How do the cyber powers in their regulatory framework look after cyber mercenarism?
General Nakasone, I'm going to pick on you first on this one, in deference to Mr. Koh's objection that proximity to the moderator is being adequately punished
Next
already.
time I'll sit closer to you, Dr. Shockey. General, what I would say is from our perspective, we've approached it from the talent piece where we are very, very upfront with our employees in terms of what they can and cannot do when they leave the agency or the command. They're briefed on it. There is laws that require them to understand their responsibilities. This is an area that we take very seriously. And those that have worked with us or work for us understand that there are certain things that they must do as they leave their employment with us, and remind that, and we make sure that they understand that as they do so.
So we have 5 minutes before this panel closes, and I would like to invite each of our speakers to make a couple of closing comments if they'd like, and I would like one of those closing comments to be a reflection on our Chinese colleagues' specific policy proposals on confidence building measures, because I thought she really introduced a very constructive element into our conversation, and nobody has picked up or responded to them. So I'd like everybody to give a moment's reflection on whether notifications can be a useful element of confidence building measures, in particular between the cyber establishments in governments, whether hotlines exist or should exist or would be a useful element, and third, whether joint academic research would increase confidence in each other. And let's go straight down the line. We'll start with you, General Nakasone. Please respond to the confidence building measures proposals, either specifically or generally, if you have any additions you'd like to add, and make any closing comments you like.
Let me start with the closing comments. First of all, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shockey. Thank you to my panelists. But thank you to all of you to come this afternoon. This is an incredibly important topic in a very, very exciting time. We all talked about the challenges that we face, but I would also say that there are tremendous opportunities out there as well. I've worked within the sector now for well over a decade, and I see those opportunities. In terms of the senior colonel's remarks, I would offer that, again, these are obviously matters that our policymakers will take on, but my own perspective on it is that our ability to communicate is among the first steps that we have to have, and one that we take very, very seriously.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Agung.
For building confidence between the countries, especially for the major countries of cyber power, of course we need the CBMs, confidence building measures. And the second, in the region, Indonesia and ASEAN, of course, including David, we will start the confidence building mission between ASEAN countries as a model for other regions or other countries. Thank you.
Excellent. Mr. Koh.
Right. I want to echo what General Nakasone said. Thank you to all of you for coming here. I was telling Cory just now that we started a cyber panel, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. And the first year that we started it, it was the last room down the side. And this room, I had difficulty getting to the the facility because there was a scrum outside, because this room had the South China Sea discussions. How times have changed. Now we are here and there was a scrum outside. I think people who were going down the last room had difficulty. I think that Singapore is, as I said, Singapore is committed to a rules-based multilateral international order. And part of that is built on the ability for us to have norms of responsible state behavior. I agree with the senior colonel that the best place for this is for this discussion to take place is at the United Nations, where all nations have a voice. The norms are perhaps not 100%, but I would say that it's at least an 80% answer. We could spend a lot more time trying to refine them, or we could start building the capability, the capacity to implement them. And I would say that the confidence building measures, which Senior Colonel Shi has mentioned, are exactly along these lines. In ASEAN, we are implementing confidence building measures. As part of the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, ADMM Plus Experts Working Group on Cybersecurity, and we are trying to implement this across the board. So besides confidence building measures, I think it has to come with capacity, because many countries don't have the capacity. So you can't just build confidence building measures. You can't say, let's implement the norms. There has to be capacity. So I think all three of them, awareness of the norms, confidence building measures, and capacity building, come together. The last thing I want to say as closing remarks really is that we've been talking a lot about doom and gloom. But I want to say that cyber is not just about doom and gloom. I think there's a lot of opportunities out there. Cyber, ICT, fourth industrial revolution technologies, these offer a great opportunity. When I look at ASEAN, 630 million people, this offers an opportunity for economic growth, to uplift the population out of poverty, for them really to leapfrog into the 21st century. But all of this has to be predicated on cybersecurity. Otherwise, it's 630 million people who would be exposed to cybercrime and hacktivists, etc. So I see cyber as a key enabler to the ability for us to exploit all the promise that technology promises us. So it's not just doom and gloom, but it's a key enabler. It doesn't slow us down, but I think it allows us to go faster. Think of it like the brakes on a car. You can only go fast if you have got good brakes. So I think you can only exploit the technology, bring it to the good of the people if you have good cybersecurity. Thank you.
Thank you. Commodore Mas.
So, just to start where I started earlier this afternoon, which was just to emphasize that the EU, so in response to the EU does support the stability in cyberspace based on the applicability of international law. And I think we've touched on some of those issues here today, but in particular the UN Charter in its entirety. So I think if you can get to a point where you've got the UN playing its role, and especially in the development and implementations of uniform norms, then yeah, we agree. The second element here, though, that I would just like to say probably in public is that we have noticed with the support of Singapore here, the confidence building measures that are being developed in the ARF format, and we're very supportive of those, and really to shout out really on your behalf about the work that you're doing with your cybersecurity centre. I mean, that's another way you can have a forum where people come together, because to me it drives down to probably what the Prime Minister of Singapore said last night, that in a lot of this it's about trust. So I think we have to be really honest internally about what some people may or may not be doing, whether it's in your name or not. And we're taking a particular view in the EU of cyber attacks that come from third parties, because probably in answer to Sir Tom's question, you know, we're realising that there are people out there who are proxies or whatever doing activity. So I think we're taking that into an account. And I come back to my sort of mantra of that in the interim, the international rule-based order is the one to hang our hat on.
The last word, Senior Colonel Shi.
Thank you for your feedback. I think we should think over about the question. What's the role of the military should play in this globalization and digital times? Thank you.
My friends, I want to express my gratitude to the people who are not native English speakers and are nonetheless giving presentations in English and asking questions in English. It's very gracious of you. And won't you all join me in thanking this extraordinary panel? for being
Corey's English isn't bad either.